The day the sky turned red, the world changed. They say history books won't remember the moments leading up to it. World War III started with quiet whispers, secret meetings, and the kind of uneasy silence that made people nervous in their own homes. But by the time the first city was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble, it didn't matter anymore. The war had already begun. Sarah Daniels watched from her window, clutching the frayed curtain as the horizon flickered with an eerie glow. Far off, muted explosions reverberated through the air. Somewhere across town, sirens wailed, but nobody moved. Everyone had learned by then that when the sirens sounded, it was already too late. They had been told to shelter in place, to hide, to stay away from the windows. But Sarah had to see. She had to know what was left. The news no longer made sense, every channel regurgitated the same hollow message: stay calm. Stay safe. Help was coming. But everyone knew help wasn't coming. It never did. Her heart thudded in her chest as she glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Midnight! Every night, at the same time, a broadcast would cut through the static on the emergency frequency. A voice, chilling and mechanical, would echo through the house. This is not the end. The world must change. This is necessary. The bombs didn't stop. The horizon burned. There was no distinction between nations anymore, no real battlefronts. The war wasn't fought with soldiers or strategies, it was fought with the press of buttons and the hum of drones in the sky. Invisible and untouchable. Nations no longer mattered, just survival. Sarah had no idea who was winning. Was anyone winning? She hadn't left her house in weeks. Every time she ventured outside, the world felt less real. The sky was a constant grey, the buildings crumbling, and the air so thick with ash it was hard to breathe. She had watched neighbors disappear, families vanish overnight. Nobody asked questions anymore, because nobody wanted to hear the answers. But there was one thing that gnawed at Sarah's mind, a memory, or perhaps a dream, that she couldn't shake. It had been weeks ago, just as the war escalated. She had been driving home, trying to outrun the first wave of chaos, when her radio flickered to life with a strange transmission. The voice on the other end, neither male nor female, whispered words that chilled her to her core. They're already here. You just don't know it yet. At first, she thought it was a joke, some sick prank amidst the panic. But then the voice returned the next day. And the next. Always at 12:01 AM. Always the same cryptic message. Now, weeks later, that voice was the only constant in her life. Every night, at midnight, the radio would spring to life, cutting through the static. And every night, the voice would repeat those same words, only slightly different. This is not the end. The world must change. This is necessary. Necessary. Necessary for whom? Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed it. Over time, she began to hear stories, whispered rumors among the few survivors left in her town. They all heard the same voice. The same message. But no one knew where it came from. Some believed it was the government, a desperate attempt to maintain control amidst the chaos. Others thought it was an enemy, broadcasting psychological warfare to break them down. But there were other theories, darker ones, that people only spoke of in hushed tones. They aren't human. Sarah overheard the conversation one night while scavenging for supplies at an abandoned convenience store. A small group had gathered in the back, their faces gaunt, eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" a young man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones pulling the strings," the older man replied, glancing around nervously. "This war. It's not about territory or politics. It's about them." Sarah wanted to ask who they were, but something stopped her. A deep, unsettling feeling gnawed at her insides. She left before she could hear the rest of the conversation. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks into months. Sarah had lost all sense of time. The world outside her window was now unrecognizable, a barren wasteland of crumbling buildings and scorched earth. The constant hum of drones filled the air, patrolling the skies like vultures circling their prey. She didn't know if the war was still raging or if it had ended long ago. There were no more broadcasts, no more news, only the occasional explosion in the distance and the unsettling calm that followed. Except for the voice. It never stopped. Every night at 12:01 a.m., the same message echoed through her home. The words had begun to change, though, subtly at first, then more drastically as the days wore on. This is not the end. The world must change. This is necessary. Then, one night, you are necessary. Sarah had stopped trying to understand it. She had given up on the idea that the world made sense. There was nothing left to do but survive, and even that felt pointless now. It was on a particularly cold, bleak night that Sarah first noticed it. Something was off, more than usual. The voice on the radio had changed again. This time, it wasn't repeating the same cryptic message. Instead, it was talking to her. Sarah? She froze, staring at the radio. No one had called her name in months. She hadn't spoken to another living soul in what felt like an eternity. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of something. Fear? Or was it hope? Sarah, it's time to wake up. Her throat was dry. She hadn't spoken in so long, her voice felt foreign as she whispered back, "Wake up from what?" Silence. Then static. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Seconds stretched into minutes. Had she imagined it? The voice returned, but this time, it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from everywhere, inside her mind, outside her window, beneath the floorboards. This isn't real. Sarah stumbled back, her legs trembling. The wall seemed to shift around her, the floor pulsating beneath her feet. She clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. This world is a lie. You're not awake. She opened her eyes. The room was no longer the same. The furniture was distorted, twisted into shapes that defied logic. The clock on the wall spun wildly, its hands moving in erratic patterns. And the sky outside was no longer red. It was black, as if the stars had been swallowed by something far darker. The world around Sarah began to unravel. The streets outside her house folded in on themselves, like crumpled paper. The buildings, the trees, the very ground beneath her feet flickered in and out of existence. She could hear voices, hundreds of them, whispering, screaming, laughing. All at once, all at different frequencies. The air around her felt heavy, as if reality itself was breaking apart. Her hands shook as she reached for the door, pulling it open. The sky was no longer visible, replaced by a swirling void of colors that made her stomach churn. In the distance, figures moved, shadowy, indistinct. They walked in jagged, unnatural motions, their limbs twisting at impossible angles. Sarah stumbled down the steps, her mind reeling. The voice echoed in her head again, but it wasn't alone now. There were others, countless others, all saying the same thing. This isn't real. You are not awake. She clutched her head, trying to make sense of it all, but the more she tried to think, the less real everything felt. Her memories, were they real? The war? The bombs? The destruction? Had any of it actually happened? She stumbled forward, her feet dragging across the crumbling street. The figures in the distance grew closer, their shapes becoming more defined. They weren't human. They were something else, something far worse. Their skin rippled, their faces stretched and twisted as if they were wearing masks, masks of people she once knew. But who were they? The ground cracked beneath her feet, splitting open to reveal a chasm of darkness. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like she was on the edge of something, teetering on the brink of a realization too horrible to comprehend. The voice in her head grew louder, more insistent. This isn't real! She wanted to scream, to fight back, but deep down, she knew it was right. Nothing about this world made sense anymore. Nothing had made sense since the war started, if the war had ever started. Suddenly, the shadowy figures were upon her, their grotesque forms surrounding her. She felt their cold, clammy hands reach out, pulling her into the abyss. But as they closed in, she didn't feel fear. She felt relief. "Wake up, The voice whispered one last time, just as the world collapsed into darkness. When Sarah opened her eyes, she wasn't in her home anymore. She wasn't in the ruined world she had known for so long. She was lying on a cold, sterile floor, surrounded by blinking lights and machines that hummed quietly. Her head pounded, and her vision was blurry, but she could make out figures moving around her. Doctors? Scientists? What? Where am I? She croaked, her voice hoarse. A man in a white coat leaned over her, his expression unreadable. You've been under for a long time, Sarah. A very long time. She blinked, trying to make sense of his words. Under? What? What happened to the war? The man exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues before turning back to her. There was no war, Sarah. It was all part of the simulation. Simulation? Her mind raced, but the memories were slippery, impossible to grasp. The bombs, the destruction, the voice, it had all felt so real. What do you mean? The man sighed, his expression softening. We've been running experiments, testing different scenarios. World War III was just one of them. We needed to see how the human mind would react under extreme stress. How you would cope with the idea of reality falling apart. Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. You're lying! This can't be real! But as she looked around the room, at the sterile walls and the unfamiliar faces, a terrible realization washed over her. Had any of it been real? Days passed, or at least, that's what they told her. Time felt different now. The world outside was normal, no ash-filled skies, no crumbling buildings. People went about their lives, unaware of what she had experienced. Or was it just another layer of the lie? Another simulation? Sarah couldn't trust her own memories anymore. She couldn't trust her senses. Every time she looked at the sky, she wondered if it would turn red again. Every time she heard the hum of a machine, she wondered if it was monitoring her thoughts. She wanted to believe the war hadn't been real, that she was safe now. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the lights were dim, she still heard the voice. The same voice from the simulation. The one that had followed her through every nightmare. This isn't real, it whispered, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out. But the voice persisted, louder this time, more insistent. None of this is real! Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She sat up, glancing around the room. It was the same sterile place she had woken up in after the simulation. Or was it? For the first time since she had woken up, she wondered if she had ever really woken up at all. Weeks passed. Sarah tried to reintegrate into society, to accept the doctor's explanations, but something gnawed at her, deep inside. She felt disconnected, as if she was watching her life from a distance, like an observer rather than a participant. The voice still spoke to her, usually in the dead of night, but sometimes it came during the day, in the middle of conversations, or while she was walking down the street. This isn't real, it would whisper, so softly she could barely hear it. But the more it spoke, the more it began to make sense. One night, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Sarah confronted the doctors. She demanded to know the truth. The lead scientist, a woman named Dr. Matthews, gave her a long, pitying look. You've been through a lot, Sarah. Your mind is still adjusting to reality after the simulation. What if this is just another layer? Sarah shot back, her voice trembling. What if none of this is real either? Dr. Matthews hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then, she said something that chilled Sarah to her core. What makes you think you've ever left? The world collapsed around her again,